Alright. Alright, I'm back. I'm Nerd Squared. I did a couple runs earlier in the marathon, but we have a couple more games left. Today, I'll be running Scorn. Scorn is a kind of an artsy survival horror game, slash puzzle game by Ebb Software, and we'll get right into it. I do want to note real quick before we start that while this game does have, or this marathon has a lot of fairly violent games in it, obviously, uh, this game in particular has some pretty graphic gore in it, so just a warning about that in advance for those that are squeamish. Alright, so we'll watch this intro cutscene. Time doesn't start yet, by the way, because it starts when I start moving after I gain control. But yeah, Scorn is basically, the way I like to describe it is it's pretty much what would happen if Amnesia, and that kind of series as a whole, mixed with modern Doom. Because this game has puzzle-solving elements, and exploring a creepy environment and all that, and you have the Doom-like elements, where you have a bit of combat with many different guns that you get throughout the game, although we're not going to see that in this category because we skip a lot of stuff in this run. And you also have this like fleshy aesthetic in the world, which is what I was talking about earlier with the graphic gore. Because this game was actually very heavily inspired by the works of H.R. Geiger. If you've ever known his stuff, you know there's a lot of body horror and biomechanical stuff in there, and you'll see that in this game as well. I'm also running with the DSJ mod. DSJ stands for double speed plus jump, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It gives me double the normal movement speed, and also gives me the ability to jump, which I'll be using a lot throughout this run to do a lot of major skips, and it drastically shortens this run compared to a run without mods. You'll see the power of that very shortly, as soon as I get started. This time's going to start very soon once our character gets up. It'll be when I start moving. So I'll start moving and then I'll say go, and we'll start. And start. Okay. So I mentioned that you can do a lot more skips with the DSJ mod, and you're about to see that right at the very start. Because you're supposed to do a tutorial here where the game teaches you how to interact with puzzles, but you can just jump right over that barrier. There's normally an invisible wall surrounding that cliffside, but because we have a jump, we can just go right over it. I'm gonna grab this bracelet here. We need this to interact with puzzles throughout the game. And, how the DSJ mod actually came about, because there's a bit of history behind it. Back when this game first came out, a person by the name of Damage Volume, who was one of the original mod and tool creators when this game came out, he created a trainer for the game. A trainer being basically a tool we use to practice the game and find glitches. It allows us to do things like save our location, give ourselves God mode if we really wanted to, and things like that. And in that trainer, for some reason, I don't know why, Damage Volume decided to include an ability to jump. And because that feature was just like a random thing that was added in, we eventually thought, why not make that a category? And so here we are, a few months later, and we have this monster of a speedrun. Yeah, how this game is structured is there's 5 acts, with the first 3 acts having 2 parts. We're in part 1 of Act 1 right now. For the most part, or for the first 13 minutes or so, first 16 minutes roughly, the game's gonna look relatively normal. Like, there are some little sequence breaks I'll be doing by jumping over walls with the mod, but for the most part it's gonna look pretty standard. But that's gonna change very quickly once we get to Act 2-2, because starting from there, we're gonna be doing full chapter skips after full chapter skips. It's really crazy. So we're doing a big puzzle here. When you first play the game, this puzzle is very confusing. It takes you a while to solve, but thankfully I already know the solution. We're doing this long puzzle because To actually get out of this act, we need to open a door that leads to an elevator that we'll use to get out of here. And we need 2 bracelets, like the one we got earlier, to actually get through that door. But we can't put that bracelet on our right arm. The game doesn't allow us to do that, obviously. So we need a second person to get another bracelet on their left arm to open the door. And in this pod that I'm fishing through this puzzle, we have a character that... we have a person. And that person is going to help us get the key to open the door. Now, all the characters don't actually have names unless you look in the art book. In fact, the game doesn't actually have any in-game text or any labeled prompts. Since the characters in this game are basically nameless, we've come up with pretty creative names for these characters. And this character that we're about to grab, we've aptly decided to nickname Steve. Shoutouts to the Scorn running community for coming up with that name. It's pretty good. But yeah, Steve's cramped in this pod, and so we're gonna go rescue Steve. We just have to wait for this cutscene to finish before we can grab him. The game at the beginning, in this run especially, it's pretty slow, because there's just a lot of little scenes like this where you have to wait for an animation to play. And because, like I was saying, this game is very artsy, it lets them play out all long and drawn out like that for the effect, essentially. Just to look cool. So we're gonna... I'm doing this little mechanism here because I'm gonna push Steve along a cart in a second in order to bring him over to give him a bracelet. Because in order to actually give the bracelet to Steve, or put this bracelet on Steve, I mean, we have to free him from this pod. And we have to wheel him over there to actually free him. There's 2 different things you can do. There's 2 different ways you can free Steve. You can either use this buzzsaw-like mechanism, thereby saving Steve, or we can free Steve from the... or we can try to scoop him out of the pod, but by doing that, we botch that and kill Steve, and then we take his arm instead. And that's what we're going to do for the run, because if you save Steve and have him hobble over to the mechanism we were at earlier, where you get the bracelet, he takes a full 5 minutes, which is a pretty big time loss. So, scooping Steve is definitely a lot faster. And it's the most optimal strat for the run. Of course, we're going to do that. Now, while the first act of this game, both parts, are relatively skip-free, we do have a trick for skipping the last part that you'll see a bit later. Because normally you'd have to open the door after we give Steve the bracelet, but we have a way to skip that now. You also notice that this room is unloaded. Rest assured, the collision is loaded, it's just that the textures didn't have time to load in. We're not entirely sure why this happens. Though my theory is that we go through the room so fast because of the fast running speed we have with the mod and the jumping over the invisible walls that we did. The game just didn't have time to load the textures. Anyway, thank you for the good luck, Tempest Mask. We have Steve in this room, and we'll put him in this machine to scoop him out. And this is one of those points where, like I was saying earlier, if you're squeamish, you'll want to look away. Because we'll try to get Steve out of this pod, and it doesn't quite work. Yeah. Rest in peace, Steve. It's fine, though, because we have his arm, and that's the important bit. Alright. So we have Steve's arm now. We're gonna go put the bracelet on his arm. That's the trigger that actually lets us leave this act. But as I said earlier, we're gonna try to skip opening the door by going out of bounds. The out of bounds for it is a little dangerous, but there is a checkpoint after scooping Steve, so if I fail it, we won't get sent too far back. I'm going to get out of bounds by jumping on this bench. Hopefully I don't fall out of bounds or fall back in bounds. Nice, that's part 1. We need to get back in bounds. And there we go, perfect Steve skip. So we've just skipped opening the door, and that saves, if you do it well, it saves around 15 seconds. The holy grail of this game would be skipping the entire sequence completely, where we save Steve. But at the moment, we haven't found a way to do that, because this area only fully loads once we grab the bracelet and put it on Steve's arm. So we don't have a total Act 1-1 skip yet, but maybe in the future something like that, or something equivalent will be found. And in Act 1-2, there's no real way to skip it. Because you have to end Act 1-2, you have to trigger a cutscene after this puzzle we'll be doing in a second, and yeah, there's no real way to skip past that. Beyond doing cheatsy stuff with the tool, which obviously wouldn't be allowed for runs, unless you're using the DSJ mod. You can use tools, as this run very obviously uses a tool, just not anything outside the DSJ mod. So yeah, the puzzle here is we have to bring these, what I think are egg sacs, in a way. We have to bring these egg sacs over to a machine and insert them in this machine. But we have to activate the mechanism to bring the egg sacs over. We also got a gun just a second ago. We have a name for it in the community that I'm not going to repeat on the stream. But I'll go ahead and call it the puzzle gun, because throughout the game, and we do that a little bit in this category as well, use it to interact with puzzles. Like right there, we just inserted it in that little mechanism to bring the egg sac over. You also notice that Steve's arm is still attached to our hand. Because we did that sequence break earlier where we avoided opening the door, we never actually inserted Steve's arm in the mechanism that we were supposed to put his arm into. So because we didn't do that, his arm is just permanently attached to our hand until we complete this act. It only goes away if you, I don't think it goes away actually if you save the game, because I haven't tried that, and reload, but I haven't tried that. But yeah, the hand pretty much doesn't go away until we complete the act. So we at least get a little souvenir of our old friend before we leave this act behind. I'm gonna jump through this window. You're normally supposed to go off to the side from where I activate the second egg sac, and you encounter a couple of enemies along the way, but we have a jump, so I can just go right through that window. And I think actually it's a little faster than going off to the side and dealing with enemies. There's some optimization with this puzzle. You'll notice there's these 3 egg sacs on the floor. Those are the 3 egg sacs we have to put into the machine. And I guess again, this game sort of intends you to do it from right to left. But it's actually a little faster by about 1 second or so, maybe a little less than a second, to do the middle egg sac first, and the right egg sac, and then the left egg sac. By the way, I'm just making assumptions about what some of these things are called, because the story for this game, it's very niche and mysterious, because the game doesn't actually tell you the story at all throughout the whole game. Even when the game was being developed and teased on social media and stuff, and in the marketing, the developers themselves, Ebb Software, have basically said, yeah, there's no story at all, and you're just kind of thrown into the world. Like some of the boomer shooters that we've seen in this marathon, oddly enough. So because of that, people have theorized as to what's actually happening in this world, because obviously the game doesn't tell that to you. And one theory I've seen that I really like is that this world that we're going through is basically biomechanical stuff gone wrong in one way or another. Because as we go through the game, we won't see it too much in this run, but as you go through the game, there's a lot of symbolism surrounding birth and maintaining your population and things like that. Like maintaining life, essentially. Yeah. Yeah, this game is definitely a little divisive among horror game and shooter game fans, but I like it personally. So yeah, we've activated our last exact there, but it goes horribly wrong and the machine breaks apart. So now our first character is gonna die. Spoiler. All the stuff that just pour on top of us from the machine is basically like a vat of acid, and it causes our character to die. So we're about to jump pretty far forward ahead in the future. The game doesn't actually tell us, again, how far ahead we jump, but I've seen a theory that says, or suggests, it's at least a few hundred years. We're jumping pretty far ahead, and we'll transition over to a second character. And we'll see what results from our first character's death a bit later on. It doesn't appear until Act 3 or so. Yeah, that's the first act done. We'll still have a bit more downtime during Act 2-1 here, because we have a fairly long run once we get out of this cutscene. But once that run is done, the game, or the run, goes from 0 to 100 very fast. There'll be a lot of crazy skips from here. Because it turns out, if you have a game that's normally running simulator, yeah, pretty much. If you have a game, it turns out that if you have a game that's normally walking simulator or running simulator of sorts, and then you add a jump to it, it breaks it pretty hard. And that's basically what you're about to see happen to this game once we get out of Act 2-1. Because Act 2-1 is one big running section. We have to get through a desert to get to Act 2-2. And Act 2-2 is where Act 2 proper really happens, and that's where the first big skip is going to be. Now we're playing as the second character. He's broken out of this pod, which is a bit like the pod that Steve was in earlier, I guess. And a quick graphic warning here. For those that are squeamish, look away now. Because we're going to remove this umbilical cord to free ourselves. What's the DSJ part? Okay, that's fine. I can explain it again. So DSJ is a mod I'm using that gives me, or that doubles my movement speed, and it gives me the ability to jump. Normally you run pretty slowly in this game, and obviously you can't jump, because it's kind of a walking or running simulator, normally. But this mod gives me double the speed, normal movement speed, and I can jump, which allows for a lot more skips compared to the vanilla or non-modded game. To give you an idea of just how much DSJ saves compared to non-modded, a non-modded run, the world record right now is 1 hour and 17 minutes, and my PB in that is 1 hour 23. And the world record for this run, and the time for this run, is under a half hour. And ideally we're going to complete this run in under a half hour, because I'm pretty consistent with this run in particular, so that shows you how much time this mod saves. Even the double speed part by itself saves like 10 minutes over the course of the run, which is crazy. And the jump just allows you to do a lot more sequence breaking. So I'm going to do a trick to get into Act 2 too early. Normally you're supposed to open a barrier to get into Act 2-2, but we want Act 2-2 to be loaded in a very specific way to do a skip coming up, and it's the first big skip of the run. So I'm going to jump into here on the right side of this archway. I'm going to jump on this railing and try to... There we go. I've clipped in the wall. This is where Act 2-2 starts as soon as I round this corner. So now you can see that the area is partially deloaded, and we want the area to be partially deloaded like this. Because the premise of the Act 2-2 skip I'm about to do is there's this elevator that's way out of bounds, and I'm going to try to do a jump to go to that elevator instead of having to do a very long series of puzzles. I also have to grab a bracelet here so that the elevator actually triggers when I go in it. And navigate some tricky invisible collision. It's a little tough to navigate here when you're first learning this, but I know where all the invisible collision is, so we're all good. I'm gonna jump out through this window, which can be a little annoying, but usually isn't too bad. There we go. gotten through the window, and now I'm back where I was before, where I was running to the entrance of Act 2 too. And because I deload the area in the way that I did earlier, by clipping through that wall, this area, once I jump on top of some more invisible collision, is going to be deloaded, so I can navigate out of bounds, and that's where I'm going to do the really big jump. And it's by far and away the hardest trick in the entire game, because it's a very precise jump. I have a setup for it, so it's a little easier, but even then it's still kind of nerve-wracking. Alright, so I'm going to very carefully set myself up, and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to set my feet right there on the ground, set my cursor very carefully. I'm good. Oh no! You're kidding me. Okay, well, that's a first. I've never actually missed that. So, that's what happens when you miss Act 2 Skip. You have to go all the way back here and get the bracelet. Thankfully, I have a pretty generous estimate relative to my PV, though, so we should still be fine. But yeah, you can see I was trying to... The elevator was all the way out of bounds there, and I have to do a very long jump to get there. And I was very carefully setting myself up before doing the jump, because you have to have a very high amount of speed leading into the jump to actually make it and land on the elevator. If you're a little off, like I was there, you'll just slip off the elevator and fall out of bounds. And in this game, when you fall out of bounds, there's no death lane, so you fall forever if you ever fall out of bounds, for any reason, so the only way to get out of that is to load a save, and unfortunately the last save at that point is right when I hit the checkpoint at the start of Act 2 too. So if you do mess it up, you lose a lot of time, but you should still be fine though. Like, the rest of the run isn't too bad, it's just this one skip that's really hard. I think my angle was a little bit off or something when I set this up initially. Should be good. Yes, alright. Second try, I'll take that. So we've just barely ended on that elevator, and we've skipped the entirety of Act 2. Because this elevator is the last elevator that you take before you enter Act 3-1. So that just skips all of Act 2 there, saving a very long sequence of puzzles. Alright, cool. So we're out of Act 2, and Act 3-1 is similarly going to have a very big skip. Because normally you're supposed to do a section where you go through a series of floors to eventually get a pod that you need to use for an elevator, all the way down here. But because we have the DSJ mod, we can just jump over that invisible wall and jump right down here. We don't have to use that pod we would get from the other puzzle. Instead, we can use this pod right here. I am going to have to jump over this pod that's already in the way, though. Because the switch to move this pod so I can use that other pod is right over here. So I'll move this pod, and then we'll move the other pod so we can use it. Because the objective of this act is to get a pod in that one spot where the claw just moved, to use as an elevator or tram of sorts, to get to the other side, which is where Act 3-2 starts. I do want to give a note, because we're doing this section in a very much unintended order, when we put this pod into the elevator and go to the other side, when we get in the elevator, it's gonna spaz out a lot and cause the screen to shake a ton. So, quick warning ahead of time for those that are prone to epilepsy or sensitive to photosensitive things like that. Yeah, so yeah, quick epilepsy warning real quick when I get in the elevator coming up. It's gonna spin around a lot. It's kind of dizzying. So we'll go in the elevator. If you're prone to epilepsy, look away now. And the reason why this happens is because since we used the wrong pod, this elevator is confused about where it should go. And so it moves along the track like it's supposed to, but just ends up spinning in place. That's Act 3-1 done. Now we're going to move on to Part 2 of Act 3. Also, this is happening now. So that first character we were playing as earlier, of course he's dead. And now he's a parasite that periodically damages our character. So we just took a bit of damage from our first character there. So similarly to Act 3-1, we're going to skip Act 3-2 entirely. Because you're supposed to do some puzzles where you lower some barriers to get a key card of sorts. And then you use that to get in the elevator that lets you lead this act. And there's some dodges you have to do. Some enemies at the end. But you can just drop right in here. Go back in bounds, from out of bounds, by running on top of the ceiling. Oh, got myself in a bit of a pickle, I think. Okay, managed to navigate there. I got inbounds there, but in some cases when you land in bounds, like I had just there, that hallway doesn't load entirely. It's similar to when I was in Steve's room earlier, where the textures are there, or the collision is there, but the textures weren't. So because I couldn't see the textures, I basically had to do a bunch of blind movement to free myself, and actually get back in bounds into the elevator. And now we're in Act 4. We're supposed to do a long series of puzzles here, or not a long series of puzzles, but we'd have to navigate what is honestly one of the most complex areas in the entire game. Besides Act 3-1, you'd have to navigate 3 puzzles where you basically move a ball through a maze. Like these right here. You'd have to go around and, while dodging some enemies, raise these puzzles so you can interact with the puzzle at the top of the level. I accidentally went out of bounds there, so I'll have to reload. You'd have to go out of bounds, or not go out of bounds, but you'd have to move those 3 puzzles up by just navigating through the level and dodging a few enemies. But, because we have the DSJ mod, we can go out of bounds and activate those 3 puzzles real quickly and just go and solve the puzzle right away. And normally this act takes around 11 minutes if you do it without DSJ. So, again, this little Act 4 skip saves a lot of time. So I accidentally moved a bit too much left and fell out of bounds. You need to edge yourself very carefully here, because instead of navigating through the level normally, we're just gonna navigate around the area where these 3 switches are while out of bounds, and we'll raise the puzzles that way. Act 4 in the vanilla run has actually changed quite a lot. For a long time, the non-modded run didn't have very many skips. And then a few out of bounds were discovered in this act, and one was very recently discovered, around a couple months ago, in Act 3-1. So very exciting stuff for the vanilla game, for sure. Now we have to solve the puzzle. We have to navigate this circle through the maze. Put it on that yellow dot in the center. And the solution for which not being too difficult to figure out. And now we're out of here. By the way, there's a character you haven't seen in this act so far, because I completely avoided every interaction with him. It's a character named Bruce, which again, another nickname from the community. He's actually a living being, and that spawns a bunch of monsters, like the monsters we would have encountered throughout the whole game. And he's also going to take us up to where Act 5 starts. And, fortunately... Eventually. There we go. Yeah, by using Bruce as an elevator, yeah, I've accidentally killed him. So, rest in peace, Bruce. But we have one last trick up our sleeve in Act 4. Because there's a cutscene before that tram up there, where the parasite of the first character would damage us. But if we jump around this ledge, and then go to the tram, we avoid that cutscene trigger. So we can completely avoid that cutscene, and we save around 15 seconds, I want to say. 15 to 20. So now we take a long tram ride to get to Act 4, or Act 5, which is the last act of the game. It takes roughly a minute and a half. And you might notice that there's no audio at all in the game right now. Uh, because we skipped the Parasite cutscene, the audio just dies in this tram ride, and it doesn't ever come back, save for our running steps. So we're gonna get no audio for the rest of the run. And I jokingly like to think of this bit where the audio dies as the game having a moment of silence for Bruce, because of Bruce dying just a second ago. This section, when you're playing without mods, where you can actually hear the audio, it's actually really nice. Like, this act in particular is really nice. There's a lot of really cool design in this game. It is an artsy game, like I was saying earlier, and Ebb Software, who are the developers, did a really good job with it. So yeah, we're about to start Act 5. It's going to be another full chapter skip, like we've been doing with the past few acts. And this is, for being the last act, fittingly, it's the hardest chapter skip in the entire run. If it goes well, it looks really cool. But if I flub up at all, I'm gonna look like a fool. And just a warning in advance, because this chapter goes by really fast. Time stops when I lose control at the end of this act. Yeah, normally in this act, you'd have to do a few boss fights, and then along the way, you try to get this parasite off you, and then you go down a runway that leads to the end of the game. But we can skip all of that. It's normally a 20-minute act if you do this without mods, and we're going to try to beat it in less than a minute. But first, I'm going to jump on some invisible geometry here to get up top. Very nice. That jump can actually be kind of hard, but went pretty well there. And this next part is going to look very dangerous, and it kind of is, but I know where all the invisible collision is, so we don't have to worry about it too much. I have to edge myself very carefully around this corner, otherwise I'll slip off the invisible geometry and fall out of bounds. There we go. And normally I do this bit a little faster, but it is kind of tricky, so I'll play it safe by just edging myself down here. Alright, I think we're good. Alright, the time ends when I lose control on the runway. There we go, time. Had a bit of a mishap with Act 2, but that's okay. It's a pretty tough skip. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and quit to the main menu, because the ending cutscene is very graphic, and I don't want to show it here. But basically what happens in the ending, to kind of summarize it, that Parasite character that damaged us throughout the run, he overpowers us and fully fuses with us, and it looks really cool, but again, it's pretty graphic, so I'm not going to show it here. So yeah, I had a timer running on my end. It's IGT, so I assume, which says 30:03, but I imagine it's a little slower than that RTA, probably around a 30:10 or something. 30:20 or so, given I had to reload a few times. Yeah, pretty good run, because, like, honestly, besides the Act 2 skip going awry, it felt pretty clean. But yeah, before I go, I want to give a few shoutouts. First off, I want to give shoutouts to Meta. I was originally planning him to have him as my co-commentator for this run, but couldn't make it. So shoutouts to him. He's also a top runner of this game with this category, and also was one of the creators for the tools I mentioned, like the training tool and the DSJ mod. Also want to shout out Looney and Bami Saiku, because those two, and Meta as well, because those three were the people that really pioneered DSJ mod as a category and did a lot of glitch hunting for skips and stuff. Also want to shout out Ebb Software for making this game. It's a really good game, and I recommend you play it if you haven't. Actually, back in the Game Awards last year, they got nominated for um, best art direction, which is very well deserved, I think, because this game is very pretty. And if you ever want to run this game yourself, it's a pretty small community right now, but we're all really nice people. Meta in particular, and some other people that we're very helpful people. Will help you learn this run if you're interested at all in learning it, DSJ or non-modded. And I also do runs of the non-modded any percent if you ever want to check those out. If you want to see what a run of that looks like. But yeah, pretty much it for me. You can cut me off whenever.